Welcome. All right, let's wake up. It's the end of the day. You guys have been through lots of exciting discussions, conversations, networking, and fun things throughout the day. Hopefully you've learned something new, met someone new, and had some new ideas spur while you're here today. I'm Melanie Cutlan. I'm a managing director at Accenture, and I'm here today with Tricia.
Hi, I'm Tricia Miller. I am also managing director at Accenture, and I am probably an anomaly here in that I am not a blockchain expert. This session is specifically around the problem, finding the problem and how you take it from a problem to a solution. That's the role I play. So my role specifically within Accenture is actually internal. So unlike most people, I don't client face. I have responsibility for the transformation of our procurement function. And so as I'm sure many of you have been involved in some of the conversations over the last couple of days and conversations that continue to be ongoing, procurement is a space that is ripe for blockchain solutions. And we happen to find one that I was very interested in as I looked at a problem internally.
Yes. So our topic, moving out of the test kitchen, is really about taking this problem space, what it looks like to innovate through the journey and go all the way to production, not just a proof of concept and such, but actually solving a real world business problem. And so I'm excited that we'll get to play this dynamic. I have been in the blockchain space since about 2015. And so I'm excited to see how we have brought together over the last few years, really, this vision and this idea and this problem together with a technology that can solve an old problem in new ways. And so what we're going to kind of talk to you about today is what we did, what it looks like, and kind of how we went through that journey together.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Again, please stop us as we go. It is the end of the day. This session, I'm sure, will be more valuable to all of us if you have questions. So put your hands up. We will definitely stop the flow. Just let us know what you want to know. All right, so let's start with that problem. This top right-hand picture here, we had a problem that internally Accenture is very focused on risk management. And that risk management process was becoming really cumbersome for us as a client and for our suppliers who had to provide the data. So the biggest problem with that particular issue was that we were struggling to get everybody to pay attention to it and to help us get their heads around how they were going to solve for it. And part of the reason for that was even within Accenture, different parts of the organization owned different components of it. If you're going to ask a supplier about GDPR, you're going to ask a supplier about information security and legal and regulatory requirements, and you're going to ask a supplier the stuff that procurement needed, you had multiple different parts of the organization in Accenture distributing the effort to do that, and also doing the thinking to come up with how to do that. And we didn't have an effective collective or part of the organization really thinking about what that was doing. So like all self-respecting professionals in Accenture, when we had an opportunity, and the opportunity came through a development program, we put on some matching t-shirts and stood up on a stage and did a skit. It was about 7 minutes long. It had a room of professionals in stitches because it really demonstrated that if you were a supplier or even an Accenture employee and you needed to get a supplier added, here were the crazy steps you had to walk through. So while none of us ended up with an agent out of that, our acting skills were abysmal, we did get what we needed as Accenture professionals, which was somebody paying attention.
It was fantastic. So I was in the audience, and it really was just like bringing to light, using drama and storytelling to explain a problem through a real world scenario. And so all of us could empathize with the problem or appreciate the problem in an entirely new way. So there was a fantastic way as you think about what is your problem that you're trying to describe and grow a solution together with. It was quite a fun way, and they won their...
We did, yeah. We pitched again. I mean, it was pretty impressive. And surprising considering the level of simplicity, and you should have seen some of the stuff we were up against. But the single male on our team, timing was pretty appropriate because it actually was right as GDPR was going live. And so the rest of us were demonstrating just how difficult the problem was, and he got to run in last minute and kind of say, hey, GDPR is hitting us right now. Who's addressing that? And so it really spoke volumes to what was needed, which was the beginning of what we wanted. We got leadership attention. Next up, I'm sure anybody and everybody in this room can appreciate that this problem's not unique, and this problem specifically isn't something that necessarily needed a blockchain. But as we started to understand it, and again, my perspective is from the procurement function, so in that scenario, I get to be the client, and I get to feel like I can ask whatever I want. The supplier wants to do business with me. But as part of understanding that, I worked on the other side, with the teams on the other side of Accenture, right? We're a supplier quite a bit, and looked at what we were seeing as a supplier to our clients. And the reality of what we're seeing is that companies are falling into a couple of different categories. Some of them, like Accenture, manage risk to the nth degree. It's an absolutely fundamental part of their business, and they have huge teams focused on it. Some of them are in the middle of the road, and some of them are depending on their size and scale and their perspective on this and what they're selling or how they're dealing, are lower in the range of what they did to manage risk as they set suppliers up. The one common theme across all those suppliers is it was increasing. So as our teams within Accenture were providing our data to our clients, we were seeing it as a growing amount of work on us. And if the work on us as a supplier grew, and I could speak to the work of us as a client was growing, we started to think about why do we need to do this on a case-by-case basis? And the beauty of being internal in a company like Accenture, where your job is to worry about procurement, when you have a question like that, I get to have 500,000 of my colleagues globally that I get to throw that question to. And so Melanie and I had already talked before she actually saw the presentation and was in that room with us. And this wasn't something that just we were thinking about internally. It was already something Accenture and part of our blockchain practice was thinking about as well.
And so just to step back and set a little bit of context, right? So she leads procurement, onboarding, how many thousands of suppliers a year? Thousands and thousands.
20,000 suppliers,
Just
globally a year, yeah.
So there's a massive volume of a problem. Onboarding suppliers, doing business with your supplier, understanding who they are, who you're doing business with, and the information about them. And then us as a service provider, then doing business and providing our data as a supplier in that scenario. So if you think of that business problem as you onboard, and you talked about risk a little bit, but for those who aren't in the procurement space, risk is huge. If you buy from the wrong supplier, you can have a PR nightmare. Right? There are rules and regulations in place. If you buy a piece of technology, right, and you haven't done your correct information security reviews, data privacy, all of these rules are significantly important. And so the process is extremely important. And as you said, we've got processes in place, but they're highly manual, they're highly process driven, and not very, hey, supplier, customer experience driven. And so I think that's where we were excited to see this is a place where there's an ecosystem coming together, right? Like we are a buyer to many, many, many people, and the same, we are a supplier. And so that's true in every value chain, right? Everybody buys something. Even if you're a small little startup, right, you're buying probably off a P card and a corporate card, and you're figuring out that expense process. But this process exists kind of all over the place, and that's what makes it really interesting, because it's the beginning of a long process that we'll talk about, but it's also a whole ecosystem that makes sense to have a technology that can help you in new ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even when we talk about the technologies and the solutions, as we've looked at this over the last kind of 5 to 7 years within Accenture, this is a growing area from a technology, just at point to point, business to business, the technologies in this space are growing. But the next iteration of that, right, the beauty of that blockchain or that community thinking is that as more and more companies increase the amount of risk that needs to be managed and data that needs to be captured, there is an opportunity for us to stop this point to point between individual suppliers and clients and create that community of, I'm going to provide the data once and share it forward, which obviously brings us nicely to that next slide.
Back to blockchain. So I think, the obvious need of, we've got information, as you said, we've solved this problem so many ways. We have lots of supplier portals. But how many of you get portal fatigue? I have to go here, I have to log in, I forget my information. Great, the first time I went to portal, I was like, wow, this is way easier than calling a help desk, This is a much better experience. And then I'm like, oh, but that data is only there. Now I have to go here and share my information. Now I have to go here and share my information. And then you're just fatigued and you give up, and data is just inaccurate. You don't keep it up to date in different places. You don't pass that information along, and you forget where do you need to update it along the way, right? So the idea where we kind of came together around bringing a distributed ledger into this capability is I now want one common experience. And you know, Dave Treat said yesterday in his keynote, right, we are not a products company, but we happen to have internal problems that we solve with technology because we're a technology company. And this one just became an easy one to say, how do we solve this for more than just ourselves? Right? And I think Tricia's been such a great sponsor in that, in saying it's not only important, and she'll talk a little bit about the problem that actually got solved all the way through to realizing value in Accenture. And I love use cases in the blockchain space and the multi-party system space where you can start to get value right away, even before you've gotten and corralled your entire ecosystem through into the process. And so we've seen these like use cases that are not industry transforming, but are pointed and specific and bring us into a story that helps us say, how do we rethink, how do we work with our ecosystems? Because there's so much we can do once we've now, like you said, got your data. Like if I'm a supplier and I can update my data once and replicate it to where I want to, and I can share some information with some and some informations with others, right? That capability, it's just a natural business combination with the technology that we couldn't do previously, and we had to stay in the portal one-to-many land.
Okay. So from a timeline standpoint, I mean, really for me, the experience here is technology, whether it's agile delivery or waterfall, you still have a similar type lead time in this space. And the idea was worked out and kind of kicked around over the course of the summer of 2018. We got funding, so we got the leadership attention, that followed by funding, which is very important if you want to do anything at all. And so we really kicked off a project in that September 2018. We stood up the MVP by March, so 6 months later, and really that was focused on the usability, right? One of the things I've been learning, while I have said and will continue to say that I'm not a blockchain expert, the data layer, the blockchain layer piece of it isn't the hard bit to stand up. It was all about the requirements and that user experience front end. And we'll, as we go through this, the next slide actually shows a little bit of that. But we stood up an MVP, really got that user base engagement to understand what the process could look like, what the user experience could look like. We engaged some suppliers. So we really were focused on not just what does the procurement person think of this solution? We looked across the people in our organization, like many of our go-to-market people, as well as what suppliers would feel, and got very positive experience. So with that, we actually gained additional funding to allow us to move this ahead. The pilot stood up in June, July, and then since then, so that was last summer, we've scaled. I think we're at 10 countries now, with another 7 or 8 coming on actually in a couple of weeks. And by the end of this fiscal, so August is the Accenture fiscal, we should have another 8 to 10 on. So again, as much as possible looking at a global solution, standard requirements, and now snowballing that deployment effect. The environment is still, for the instance we're on, solely used internally by Accenture, but it is up and available as a test environment. You tell me what the right term is, but essentially a dummy site for others then to use as needed.
Yeah, I think did you guys catch that scale? Like how many countries you've got by the end of the year?
We should be on about 25 or 6 by the end of the year, and third, I might be overstating it, probably 20,000 suppliers when I look at those countries.
So 26 countries live on a blockchain that transform a process, that give them a user experience that was previously help desk driven, emails, manual processes, but also a leapfrog in technology, right?
Absolutely.
Like this is a simple user experience, but it's leapfrogging the technology, and I like to think about it as you designed a multi-tenant solution, but you're the first tenant. Like, you still got to put somebody in first, right? Somebody's got to move in, test the buildings, make sure that the keys work, the locks work, security is all good. And it's been a fantastic experience to watch the journey as you guys roll out more and more countries through the process. And by natural, just talking about like the pride you have in the solution, it's excited the market in an interesting way. And I think that was, unexpected, but also exciting, right? Like, we're the first test bed for something that can then kind of transform and leapfrog that user experience in a space that's been highly low tech in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's spend a few minutes on the solution. I know the image here is kind of small, but again, when it comes to the user interface, really focused on as simple a view as possible for both our end users, because 500,000 people now in Accenture globally. Any given year, we have about 50,000 people transacting, and we're a decentralized buying organization. So that means anybody and everybody in Accenture at any given point, from senior to junior, will be responsible for raising their own requisition or invoice. We had about 20,000 suppliers, so that means, again, infrequent users, you're dealing with about 20,000 infrequent users when we're fully at scale on this. And that's internal infrequent users, and then 20,000 suppliers when we get to that point as well. So usability was core, simple visibility to the process flow. We really focused on how we would capture all of the initial risk assessments. So one of the pieces we really found was we're not going to get rid of the information security run risk processes or the legal run risk processes in our company because procurement say so. So we have more focused on saying we'll capture the initial information, we'll do the assessment to determine what the risk is, and then we'll feed that back out to the other systems. So instead of 100% of our suppliers having to go through these other systems just to even determine if there was a risk, that is centralized here, and we're down to, depending on the particular risk area, 1 or 2% of suppliers hitting into those other systems where that's needed. So just from a usability standpoint, both on the requester and from a supplier standpoint, a significant saving in time. So that's back to one of the points Melanie said. We were able to build a pretty compelling business case. We've also been able to scale back some of those alternative systems. While the heavy processing is needed, we were able to take away some of their front end and reduce the cost of ownership across some of the other systems. Another big piece of this, and again, I can't say enough how Accenture views risk. We were laser focused over the last couple of years on data updates to supplier data, and for multiple years had implemented a process where for critical data, we were doing dual validation. So if the supplier sent us an email asking for an update, we called. If they called us asking for an update, we emailed. And that was an extremely manual and laborious process. Not just the effort to do that activity, but then the effort to call 4 more times in the hope you, 1, either get an answer, or 2, get someone who will actually validate what we needed. So a significant effort. I mean, in 1 year alone, I know we saw 8,000 to 10,000 of those requests going out and being managed by our AP team. Solution like this allowed us to eliminate that because this ensures that the supplier themselves owns that data. So regardless of how the request to update the supplier data comes in now, we push back to the supplier and we send them the request to make that change in here. And through that, we have taken that risk and that need for that control out of our hands.
I think shifting the liability, I think you see that across multi-party systems, right? Shifting the liability of who owns the data and how much can you trust that data. Like the first time we talked years ago about like your call, recheck, call, there has been, fraudulent moments where people will call in, change the data, and then the record is now on our side and incorrect. And we could take actions on that, right? Pay an invoice, do things. And so these multiple checks were to remove that risk in the process. And I think it's a perfect scenario for when you talk about multi-party systems, where's the trust? And where's our lack of trust? So we don't trust our suppliers because we don't know who is the right delegate today, right? Yesterday, the delegate who was allowed to change it might have just gotten fired, right? And so how do they kind of manage that process, and how do they take the liability to say it's their responsibility to own the data and participate in the network in a new way? And so I think that's where that trust equation is completely shifting that burden that allows not only, right, your streamlined process of having to do less work behind the scenes, but actually then creating an environment where we have a better relationship and a better experience with our suppliers because it's easier for them to do business with us.
Yeah, and that comes back to that ecosystem, right? This mindset of we're the client and you're the supplier and here's how the rules we will play by. I think we all recognize over the last couple of years that shift has moved, right? We are better off together in a partnership in an ecosystem with our clients and suppliers, and systems like this, communities essentially like this, in my mind, feed into that concept and feed into that relationship. Okay, so kind of if you want to talk a little bit about where we're going from here when we take it from something that we internally continue to push forward to where we Accenture continue to push this out to clients.
So as we've talked to clients about this, number one, it's a fun thing to show off with a client of like, hey, look at what Accenture did, which creates a new conversation of what do you need and how would this work in your business and where would you go? We've realized there's a bunch of third-party data that actually helps you attest who your supplier is, right? You've got a number of different data sources that can be integrated that can then let you trust that data even more, right? So if I can say, here's someone I trust to attest the data along the way. Features and functions, right? This is a user experience driven solution, which will continue to need features and functions just like any solution. And then kind of getting to that full marketplace. Like I said, single tenant, one's a lonely number, time to get more tenants into the party, right? As we bring more and more features along, I think that's where it really starts to shift the experience, where we can have the buy side and sell side of an activity that start to give you a new experience. And so that's where we get excited about the long-term roadmap, while saying at any given time, while there's interest and excitement in the market, we're still solving a day-to-day problem and can make sure that we have a balanced perspective where we're not just designing something on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. They got their test client, and the test client is happy to come along in our case. Okay, so just a couple of kind of key outcomes. And again, we're at that, as I said, 20 countries probably in the next couple of weeks here. We have seen a reduction in time. So suppliers are responsive. The requesters are definitely taking action quicker. We're obviously seeing a greater increase in compliance and risk management, because we're no longer expecting people to hop into 3 different systems and hoping that they do it or chasing them to do it. That initial risk assessment is happening in one place. And then that reduction in manual data entry. Overall, the key KPIs that we're tracking are very positive. I think one of the things that's been, again, insightful to me and speaks volumes to the need for this to be that many-to-many, that community environment, is that even with this positivity and how we have moved ourselves forward in how we manage that supplier data capture and update, or supplier data capture and maintenance, we still see about 30% of our suppliers don't immediately respond. So they take chasing. The same with whether that's a new supplier that we send the request out to and ask them to submit the data so we can begin the transaction, or it is an update to our suppliers. And again, this speaks volumes. That 30% aren't refusing to follow our process. That same percentage of suppliers, or maybe even greater, are creating that problem for all of their customers. And as this area, as the demands and expectations in this area continues to grow, we will see that happen more and more. And so that many-to-many opportunity means that the supplier will have the capability of providing that data once and feeding it out multiple different times, making something like this longer term far more appealing.
And so I think what I started my days in P2P, right, and actually implementing Ariba for Accenture. And it's been just a long journey of seeing the technology continue to evolve, and us to try to get streamlined and automated and applying AI and trying to make it better. But at the end of the day, this is a place where this entire roadmap can get reimagined. And this is the starting point, right? Once you know who you're doing business with, then you want to probably write a contract with that person. And that's information you want to share. You want to know who those contracts are with. So you have master data around a supplier, but then you want to write a contract with them. Once you have a contract, you start transacting. I was in a room, actually in Phoenix last year, with our innovation of a number of CPOs, and they said, I love these tools, I love contract management solutions, but unless I can actually use it to validate my transactions, come back later. Like, it's really an end-to-end process, right? And as this data can start to flow through, our vision of how this starts to transform is not just transform procure to pay, but order to cash, right? Because a purchase order is a sales order. It's the same thing. We just put them in two different systems and call them different names. Like, if we can bring them together in a multi-party system and actually trust that that data flows throughout its life cycle, that it applies to the rules of the ecosystem that we've agreed to up front, we can start to get to a point where we're trusting our data, we have cleaner information, we're less fallouts, less manual activities and reconciliations, which I hate to say because I'm an operations person and that, it's part of our business, but it is so important that if we can just streamline it and get the data right and trust that data, it starts with who are you doing business with every single time. And then it says, what business do you want to do with them? We've seen the same use case apply in trade finance, right? We're doing trade finance around the world. Who are you buying from? Who are you exchanging information with? Who are you financing with? The same construct starts to work. So I love this one as a kind of a starting point experience. And as you said, it's that data layer is blockchain, doesn't matter to the business. It really shouldn't matter to the business. It's really about how do you start to change that story of trust? How do you change the way the life cycle of a transaction works and actually goes back and validates the data along the way so that kickouts don't happen, so that delays in processing don't happen, and the amount of time it takes to then reconcile and end of the day get paid, right? Like, a supplier wants to get paid for the services delivered, and if I can't validate that your address to send it to is correct, there's a delay, right? And so then we've got this lack of trust, it hurts our relationships, it hurts us downstream, and so the way we've looked at it is really, how do you reinvent the entire life cycle, right? If we can build this many-to-many, how do we then bring more value to that ecosystem, starting somewhere simple and beneficial, but then growing to that ecosystem where you start to transform the whole thing and trust our core data, run transactions against trusted data, and actually get to frictionless processing, right? That's our goal, is getting truly to frictionless processing.
Yeah, and I think, again, back to this ecosystem, I don't know about different companies, but we're at about 95% of our spend in transactions with about 5% for suppliers. We have a large tail spend, and that's not unusual in a company that runs everything indirect, right? We don't create anything, so we don't have direct spend. But the vast majority of our spend and transactions are with a very small number of suppliers, and that's where that environment is something we have to aspire to, because the effort to manage from that starting point of data all the way through the transaction and the reconciliation of the payment with a supplier that you do millions or tens of millions of dollars a year with and hundreds of thousands of line items of transactions doesn't make sense longer term. Right? We have that trust relationship with them. We're absolutely dependent on them for our success, and they're dependent on us. Why do we still operate in different systems, right? Your point around P2P is our version of their OTC, and my OTC colleagues at Accenture face off with our clients' P2P. There is enough volume in that for some of those companies, some of those vendors that will benefit from managing that relationship, that it's a no-brainer to come into the trust arrangement and to build out that level of transparency in a shared environment. So I'm ready for the rest of the boxes not to be gray. But.
Yeah, they're probably hard to read across the room.
You're the group that can help do that, right?
Yes. Yeah, they are probably hard to see across the room, but really that intent, right, is it's that vision of how we want to kind of change the game completely and think about it in new ways. So let's open it up for questions. Yes, John.
How about as far as the 30% that aren't going into the new system, you hold back payments, or what's kind of the carrot and stick to get the other 30% going in?
Can you repeat the question for the mic?
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. So the question was around the 30% I said that aren't responding immediately. Do we hold payment? Do we, have a workaround? It is a great question, and trust me, it's one that we've had a lot of conversations around. Accenture's committed to payment on time. and we've signed up in multiple different countries with government commitments, etc. So we are laser focused on this one, but we are actually playing hardball. So we are taking the position of you have to own your data. We will make that as easy as possible for you. We will support you at that, that outlier. You will get that personal follow-up. When it comes to updates, it's a little bit easier. We just inform the supplier we're going to continue to transact with you on your old data. And then if that's a problem, you will go in and make the changes. But we really are playing hardball because for this to work and for us to be able to eliminate that control point, we have to do that.
Yeah.
So I'm a procurement leader with a blockchain problem.
Fantastic.
I could probably ask you 100 questions, but one thing I saw was talking about the integration with the procure-to-pay system down the road. I mean, it sounds like you're on Ariba. I mean, what's stopping an Ariba, like, this applies across industries too. What stops the existing platforms that are there bringing blockchain into their ecosystems themselves? So your Aribas, your Coupas, Zykas, Password, whoever it is. Why are they doing this? Why is this different to that?
Everyone's favorite question. Yeah. And it's a bit of hurry up industry, right? There are a lot of ways you can solve this problem. She started with you could solve this problem without blockchain. What I think portal fatigue is the problem is the idea of like, here's mine, come join mine, here's mine, come join mine. And right, so we need to think about as an industry, how do we do this in a way that lowers the barrier to adoption, encourages more movement into it, and doesn't make it a here's my solution, here's your solution, here's a bunch of portals, right? Because I think there's been, like you said, you could buy a solution to do this better today. I think and that's what we're talking to people about is how do you think we could rethink this problem in a way that is in a multi-party system that's not so client specific, so system specific, right? Because Ariba has an Ariba network for Ariba customers, and Coupa has one, and others, right? There are many standards out there. There are less in the direct space. And so in the direct spend, that's where your strategic purchases are as well. And so there's much more importance to get that data right and accurate. And so I think, we're going to continue that journey and having the conversations with our alliance partners, which include many of those, right? As well as with customers to say, how do we tap into this market? And, showing and leading a bit by example in that sense of this works and it helps. So how can we kind of bring the industry together?
Yeah, I mean, it really is a great question. And of course it's one, right? I'm not in client delivery. I wanted something off the shelf, right? And for me, it's a bit of a head scratcher. But I think it's exactly what it is, right? This is an evolving environment. And whatever the end state solution we end up with in next year and 3 years from now, the critical piece, I think, is going to be the plug and play between all those different networks. And as long as some of these are working as competitors, that's going to be tricky. But I mean, we will continue internally to get value out of it, as externally we look at how this becomes relevant and what's happening in the market.
Looks like a question, maybe not a question. Go ahead, John.
Looks like you had a hybrid blockchain solution. I'm assuming that's for GDPR compliance or California privacy compliance.
He's looking at me like I might know. I know we are GDPR compliant, if that helps.
On the slide, it's hybrid blockchain.
So it is on Fabric today, and the GDPR compliance is really around data residency, right? And the clients owning their data, giving permission for us to have their data, and it really solves that problem almost automatically, right? If you say, I have given you your data, and now I have this lineage of those transactions in which they gave that information to me so that I can trace where it is and if it ever does need to be forgotten, right, in that sense. But when you're in a trusted relationship with a supplier, GDPR is a little bit different, right, because those transactions are historical and they have to be maintained for audit and such purposes. So I think we've got a really great way of that data residency, of that ownership of that data is what solves that GDPR problem. All right, with that.
All right, no,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's looking way in the future and something like this. I mean, do you envision a scenario here where invoices go away eventually? And
Yes!
smart contracts
Sorry, that was fairly loud. Yes.
Where does it?
Yeah, I mean, the whole purpose of an invoice is to say, I'm billing you for something we already agreed to a long time ago, right? Like, I have been in workshops for years saying, how do we eliminate the invoice? And we've been doing it with automation, with AI, and getting closer and closer and closer. But e-invoicing never took off. Right, and e-invoicing was maybe a bit of portal fatigue and such as well, but if we can get that transaction upfront agreed to and show the processing, opportunities, where I think, and this I could go forever and we'll be at the event tonight, I could talk, but where I think there's some interesting innovation in this space is banks now want to play as well to see the transaction so they can offer trade financing. You saw, if anyone was in the room in the last session, to offer like invoice discounting. So if I could trust that an invoice is really an agreement between me and Tricia to pay for something, then a bank can offer all kinds of new things. So offering new parties into your supply chain or your logistics provider, right? Like all kinds of parties want to come in here when seeing the innovation happen in different sizes and spaces and paces. But at the end of the day, it's one atomic transaction. We agree to purchase something, and then all these industries go into play to figure out how to complete that transaction, right? And so if we can get there, like that would be just, it's a personal goal of mine, get rid of the invoices.
Yeah, and I mean, your point around all the industries that come into play and interact in that transaction, all of that adds friction. So I think I might be more cynical than most people at the conference around the timeline for blockchain. I think on the last session, the question I wanted to ask is, it really comes down to the community. A blockchain is really just a technology, and if you can't figure out what's needed to get the community in, then it's just a blockchain. But I wholeheartedly feel like, yes, it'll go away. It's unnecessary work that will be hard to justify if there's an alternative. Sorry.
Michael?
That's right. So internally, how hard of a sell was this?
I mean, honestly, there was, like I said, 6 of us up on a stage in black t-shirts, and I'm embarrassed by the fact, but it was the most effective sale. My job is to sell business cases. And we literally had the person acting as, I just want to get a supplier set up, walking through this, like, hey, what does procurement need? Legal, information security. So eye-opening. So I will say for that period, very easy. For the 3 or 4 years before that we'd been saying, okay, is everybody quite aware just how cumbersome this is? It was a hard sell, right? Because it was, while we have a value-driven business case out of this, as you look at the priority within a procurement function, and kind of what systems have to come first, it was down the list. And this was probably, it's a good thing for Accenture, but it was definitely one of the bigger barriers to us moving across the push, or getting that push for the single system. Accenture was managing risk already. It's much easier if you're in an environment where you're not doing any of this, then you should be selling the hell out of, hey, we need a single system to do it all. But we weren't worried about the risk because it was locked down. We managed to use that skit to convince them, yeah, but look how bad this is.
Very effective. Very, very effective. All right, well, I know you guys have an exciting evening planned. We will be there and available for questions afterwards if you'd like. Thank you for your time and your great questions. There's a great session.
Yes, thank you for showing up. I mean, really, at 5:05, I was not optimistic to see any faces at all. So thank you, guys.
Thank you all.